On November 11th, 1930, Rudolph Valentino's handyman, Lou Mahoney, took the witness stand in a Los Angeles County courtroom to testify on behalf of Valentino's manager and executor, S. George Ullman, as Ullman petitioned the court to accept his executor's first account and defend himself against charges of mismanagement brought against him by Valentino's brother Alberto. I cite Lou Mahoney's testimony from the court reporter's transcripts in case number 83678, the estate of Rudolph Guglielmi Valentino. And I quote, Luther H. Mahoney, called as witness by and on behalf of the respondent S. George Ullman, having been first duly sworn in, testifies as follows. Now he responds to a question from George Ullman's attorney. Lou answers, after Mr. Valentino's death, up until the time of Mr. Valentino's death, every order I had come from Mr. Valentino. Of course, on the death of Mr. Valentino, I got my orders coming direct from Mr. Ullman. The question, state what you saw and leave to the court the conclusion of what he did from what you saw. Lou answers, I seen the big staff working in the office all the time at the house, merely inventorying the estate. Question, were you present at any of these sales? Answer, oh no, they handled them all. Question, what did Mr. Ullman do at these sales? Answer, supervised the entire work of the sale. Question, was he the one that built that stage out there? Lou answers, no, sir. Question, did he order it built? Answer, he ordered everything pertaining to the sale handled. Question, do you know anything about this boat? Answer, the boat? Question, yes, sir. Lou answers, oh, yes. He had the boat brought from the bay up to a lot by the place where we had the sale, because he told me if we sold it, if it were sold on the water, he would get $100. And if it was sold down there at the property, why, we could get more. Now, Lou's subsequent testimony that day was covered in the Los Angeles Times, and I quote the article titled, Valentino Case Gets Surprise, and I quote, Luther H. Mahoney, who described himself as superintendent of Valentino's personal estate, testified that he met the actor first in November 1925. He said that after Valentino's death, Ullman placed him in charge of the Ritz Cleaners, an enterprise the actor controlled. He said that Ullman was busy trying to get money so that Valentino's employees could eat. Quote, he must have succeeded. The witness looks well fed, commented attorney Leonard H. Wilson for Ullman. Mahoney is stout. Mahoney related that Ullman increased the auction sale price of Valentino's schooner after the actor's death by taking the vessel out of water and setting it up in Hollywood. It could sell for $100 in the water, but on land it sold eventually for $3,000, said Mahoney. What was Alberto Guglielmi doing when you were conducting the business of Ritz Cleaners? Asked Attorney Wilson. Nothing, replied Mahoney. End quote. Today in this episode, we delve into and document the intriguing story of Rudolph Valentino's handyman, Luther H. Mahoney. A story of subterfuge, mystery, a missing page of Rudolph Valentino's will, and some memorabilia. Why does Lou, as he was known, who was a member of Valentino's household staff, have a role in the story today at all? Why was he not mentioned in any of the biographies on Valentino until 1965, when he reappeared to grant an interview and record his memoir? In doing so, why did he omit the story of his substantial involvement in the settlement of Valentino's estate, which caused the ruination of Valentino's manager, George Ullman? Did Lou Mahoney destroy the critical second page of Valentino's will? If so, why would he? Who was Lou Mahoney? What really happened way back then? This and much more in this episode we title Rudolph Valentino, the Handyman, and more.
Ciao, I am Renato Floris, the publisher of all the scholarly and entertaining books on Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova, by Evelyn Zumaya. I'm here today with Evelyn to discuss more about her fascinating work. Ciao, Evelyn.
Ciao, Renato, and it's good to be here. As I mentioned in our opener, today's topic is a gentleman who worked as Rudolph Valentino's handyman, both in the Whitley Heights residence and in Falcon Lair. I uncovered an untold story about Lou Mahoney, which cast his history in regards to Valentino in a different light than what is presented today. In bringing forth these uncomfortable truths, I have been accused of character assassination, but I think I had nothing to do with what happened then. I am compelled to address the subject of Lou Mahoney because I discovered the documentation, and I cannot let the current mountain of lies and misconceptions, specifically about Lou Mahoney and George Ullman, go unchallenged with the data I have before me. Because I think this is what an accurate history is about. The data, the raw data, the science of research discovery which makes something a fact and no longer an opinion. I will be citing my sources in this episode, just as I did in the endnote section of Affairs Valentino, and if I present a theory and hypothesis, I will label it as such, so you know. So Lou Mahoney, the story goes like this. My discovering all that I did about Lou Mahoney happened for two reasons. One, because I had access to online newspaper archives, which were just becoming available online when I began researching the story in 2000-2001. And two, because I set out in those newspaper archives to vet the 1975 S. George Ullman memoir and learn all I could about the lawsuit Rudolph Valentino's only brother Alberto brought against Valentino's manager, George Ullman. Now, I discovered Ullman's then unpublished 1975 memoir after locating Ullman's children, who at the time were both in their 80s. They were adamant I fact-check their father's story and locate the court records to verify his performance as Valentino's executor. Consequently, I spent a great deal of time poring through those newspaper archives for all reports of the day. It was while I was conducting this research I uncovered the story of Lou Mahoney's involvement, and in article after article, I was amazed this had not been covered before, never mentioned by him or any biographer, and I wondered why. But, as you know, Renato, as time wore on, I realized why.
So, you were the first biographer to write about Lou Mahoney's involvement in Affairs Valentino, but I also know you also have some new theories now. Your thinking on some things has changed over the years.
Yes, Renato, it has to some degree. But more about those new theories in a bit here. For listeners not familiar with Lou the Handyman, a bit of his history. Lou Mahoney was a New York City police officer, along with his younger brother Charles, and their story as police officers and then ex-police officers has its origins in Prohibition. Lou was assigned to a precinct in Queens, where he worked as a driver for the chief inspector of the 12th Division, Thomas J. Kelly. In an effort to curb violations of the Volstead Act, Prohibition, the New York City Police Commissioner Enright launched an investigation. And it was then when Inspector Kelly's precinct came under scrutiny. Kelly was charged in March of 1924, and with this news and a possible subpoena in their future, Lou and his brother turned in their badges, and with their entire family, some 17 members, they all packed up and left Jamaica, Long Island, to head to California. On April 30th, 1924, the Mahoney family left for greener pastures. And I cite an article in the LA Times dated May 7th, 1924, Clan Mahoney hits the trail. Just as the sun was rising today, 17 Mahoneys started on their caravan trail from Jamaica, Long Island to the Pacific coast. Scores of neighbors and friends, in spite of the early hour, waited in front of Luther Mahoney's home at number 96 Canal Street and shouted a hearty farewell as the 4 automobiles started off. Movie cameras clicked, too, while Rex the German police dog, Bobby the cat, and Jerry and Dick the canaries, who are going along, showed their approval in their own particular ways. The Mahoney group will spend the night somewhere between Philadelphia and Baltimore, and tomorrow will begin the Santa Fe Trail that will take them all the way to Los Angeles." End quote. Now, the timing of Lou's departure becomes important because when he surfaces in 1965 to grant an interview on the occasion of the 39th anniversary of Valentino's death, some 41 years later, and when he begins to tell his version of the story, the dates of when and where he met Valentino begin to conflict considerably and make little sense. But back to the story. Now, once in Los Angeles in 1924, Lou secured work as a mechanic and prop man on the lot of M.C. Levy's United Studios. Lou refers to this as the United Artists Studio, but it was then United Studios, where Ritz-Carlton Pictures was producing Valentino's film Cobra at the time. So Lou, through a connection on the studio lot with designer William Cameron Menzies, was dispatched to the Valentino's home to build an aviary for Natasha Rambova. And this is how he came to be hired, along with his brother Charles, as general handyman for the Valentinos. Now, Lou and Charles Mahoney would work for Valentino until the star's death in August of 1926. Lou was paid $45 a week and Charles $30 a week. I cite their weekly pay from the court-ordered audit of George Ullman's bookkeeping conducted by Harry Baskerville as itemized under the entry Salary 1926. Now, in his role as handyman, Lou acted as chauffeur and mechanic. He managed the general maintenance of the property, and this included the care of those 6 Falcons. Today, such a position is called facilities. Now, much of Lou's story was recorded a few months before his death in 1968, when he taped his memories. These tapes were used as a primary source in The Intimate Life of Rudolph Valentino, a book by Jack Scagnetti, which would be published in 1975. I add that this publication did not mention Lou's role in Alberto Valentino's case against George Ullman.
I know you listened to those tapes Lou recorded in 1968.
Yes, I did, Renato. The tapes were recorded on Lou's 75th birthday, December 13th, 1967. And he passed away on April 27th, 1968, some 4 months later. Those tapes have quite a history themselves. Now, my friend and colleague, Father Michael Morris, had copies of those tapes. When he was researching his biography of Natasha Rambova, Madame Valentino, he met with Lou's daughter, Madeline Reed Mahoney, and she loaned him the reel-to-reel tapes Lou made. Michael returned the tapes to her, but not before making his own set of cassette tapes. In 2003, he loaned me his cassette tapes, and I listened to them, made notes, and transcribed one of them. I returned the tapes to Michael, but they were not to be available too much longer. When he agreed to loan materials to the Valentino spokeswoman, Janine Villalobos, among other materials from his archive, she borrowed the Mahoney tapes, and to the date of this recording has yet to return them. As I have been granted custody of Michael Morris's archive, she may return them to me. So I had my notes, some pages of transcript, which I made from one of the tapes. But as I said previously, it all did not have much bearing on my work until I began vetting the Ullman 1975 memoir and discovered Lou Mahoney's backstory, as I call it. Now, on those tapes, his practical stories of life as the handyman were charming and could have certainly been so much more had he not spent very much of his time extremely angry and trashing George Ullman. He seemed preoccupied with this, and it was clear he really hated Ullman. I think the expression "he had an axe to grind" came to my mind, with the definition of that phrase being someone who has a grievance with someone, especially where one feels the need to seek damaging retribution. Despite Lou's outrage, recalling his 40-plus years old memories of Ullman being upset over money and expenditures in the household and such. To me, this only revealed the difficult job Ullman had in reining in Valentino's spending and keeping his business in some functioning order. Lou made things sound extremely stressful for Ullman. Now, most of the story Lou relates took place in the last few months of Valentino's life in 1926 in Falcon Lair. And this introduces the next character in this saga, Valentino's brother, Alberto. Alberto and family were guests in Falcon Lair during that time frame. Now, after Valentino's death that August, Ullman was appointed executor of the Starr's estate. Alberto Valentino, well, he despised that fact and set out upon his arrival from Italy to unseat or dethrone George Ullman in all possible ways. And to a great degree, this is still going on today. And that will stand, for the moment, as an incredibly simplified version of those thorny events, because that is a story I cover extensively in Affairs Valentino. And today, I am focusing on the role handyman Lou Mahoney played in the legal case Alberto brought against Ullman in 1930.
So, in those tapes, Lou recorded he did not talk about his role in Alberto's litigation against Ullman, no?
No, Renato, he did not. In those tapes, in between his memories of broken cars, repairs on the restraining wall, and the plumbing for the aviary, Lou accused Ullman of every possible crime, blamed him for anything and everything, and could barely relate the simplest memories without making his hatred of Ullman apparent. Now, in my opinion, even if I knew nothing about Ullman, I would think Lou was unrealistically cruel and his heavy attacks unwarranted, and I can say revealing, as I began to piece the whole story together. Very revealing. After 42 years, why would someone record their memoir and devote so very much time of their history to hating someone they knew decades earlier? There was obviously more going on there for Lou. So yes, he was summoned to the witness stand in the fall of 1930, November, and again in January of 1931. And his reason for being there was something he did not include as part of his legacy. His complete evasion of the issue speaks clearly as to his wish to hide the story for some reason and hopefully bury the events, which in fact took place.
So, how did Lou end up on that witness stand?
When Valentino died in New York City in August of 1926, George Ullman was there with him at his deathbed, along with Valentino's godfather, Frank Manillo. Ullman traveled to New York with Valentino for the openings of The Son of the Sheik. Valentino's brother Alberto and family, as I mentioned, had just departed New York to return to Italy after having spent a few months visiting Valentino in his Los Angeles home, Falcon Lair. Upon his brother's death, Alberto returned to the U.S., arriving in early September. He then boarded the funeral train west with Ullman and his brother's body, headed back to Los Angeles. So while they were all traveling, Handyman Lou was in charge of the household. And after he received news of Valentino's death, he was there alone for a few weeks before the funeral train with Valentino's body, Executor Ullman, and Alberto arrived in Los Angeles. I allege that by the process of elimination, during this time frame, Lou removed Valentino's will from the Falcon Lair office safe and destroyed a second page which consisted of instructions Rudolph Valentino left for George Ullman. For by the time George Ullman arrived back in Los Angeles and prepared to take possession of the will and file it with the probate court, the will consisted of only one part, leaving Ullman confused, as he distinctly recalled Valentino telling him there was a second page of instructions. When this was nowhere to be found, George entered into the executorship with his authority hindered by the vague terms of the half-will. On that half of a will, Valentino named his brother, sister, and Natasha's Aunt Teresa Warner. And with this, George believed them to be the rightful heirs. Now, when I said by the process of elimination, I state that according to the testimony given, 3 people had the combination to the Falcon Lair safe: Valentino himself, Alberto, and Handyman Lou. Meanwhile, based on the portion of the will he had in hand, Ullman proceeded to disperse substantial cash advances to the supposed 3 heirs as they borrowed against the final settlement of the estate, and in Alberto's case, petitioned Ullman for those cash advances. Throughout the subsequent 4 years, until Alberto filed his lawsuit against Ullman, Ullman sought to close out the business of the estate, file his executor's account, and throughout, he continued to insist there was more to Valentino's will. His claim presented in court that part of Valentino's will was missing was covered, I'd say, pretty extensively in the press during the hearing. And I cite just one article from the New York Times on November 8, 1930, titled "Valentino Paper Missing, Document is Vital to Executor, Attorneys Say," in which Ullman made the assertion in court that day that Valentino's office safe was raided and a critical portion of his last will and testament removed. And I quote the article. Attorneys for S. George Ullman, retiring executor of the estate of Rudolph Valentino, the late film star, reported to the probate court today that a, quote, document of the utmost importance has been stolen from the dead actor's safe, end quote. And I quote Affairs Valentino about this, page 158, and I quote, "The court proceedings continued to drag on into December, when the judge made the announcement to adjourn until January. Before leaving the courtroom for the holiday break, George made a startling revelation to the court from the witness stand when he alleged that, quote, a document of the utmost importance was stolen from Valentino's safe, end quote. He explained his claim by saying this document should have been attached to the original copy of Valentino's will. George went on to state how this paper supported his claim Valentino directed him to act both as executor and as head of the production company. He added that prior to Valentino's death, his will was kept in the Valentino office safe, and only 3 people knew the combination to that safe: Rudolph Valentino, his brother Alberto, and Lou Mahoney. Reporters smelled a juicy headline, and the next morning the public read all about the document's mysterious disappearance and the rifling of Valentino's safe, end quote. I add, as a relevant side note, that in my search for the court records of Alberto's case against Ullman, I discovered the entire original case file was stolen from its rightful housing in the Los Angeles County Hall of Records. I have spoken about this in several previous episodes, but with Ullman's children insisting I not write about his tenure as executor until I had facts and access to those records, I searched for about 1 year before finding some 1,000 certified copied pages of those original stolen records, as they were filed when Ullman appealed his case. These are the records I am citing and referring to today. Now, some of the transcripts of testimony from that hearing are included in those court records, including Lou Mahoney's testimony, as well as a few other informational things which add to Lou's role in the lawsuit and that missing page of the will. I found the articles about the handyman Lou Mahoney's appearance on the witness stand and his role in the missing page of Valentino's will remarkably easy to find. Frankly, I could not believe what I was reading. In all the books on Valentino, I had never read this nor heard about it in Lou's taped memoir. This story was never told yet, and there it was, laid out before me. Stunning.
I know Ullman eventually did find that second page of the will. Did Lou admit to removing the page on the witness stand?
No, he did not, Renato. During the fall hearings in November 1930, Lou did testify in support of Ullman, with no mention of that sought-after second page of the will. Even when Ullman made that formal plea to the court, alleging a portion of Valentino's will was removed from the safe, as we just heard, Lou said nothing. Now, it was during those fall hearings the judge asked for the paperwork on the Valentinos' divorce. So then we have a Christmas break, with the hearing scheduled to resume in January. Over that holiday break, the lawyer who drew up the Valentinos' divorce, Raymond Stewart, searches in his files for the documents requested by the judge, and he finds a crumpled onion skin paper carbon copy of that second page of Valentino's will and those instructions Valentino left for Ullman. Raymond Stewart notifies George Ullman, who then learns he's been disbursing money to Alberto and Maria erroneously, because on that second page of the will, Valentino stipulates he left his entire estate to his sole heir, his nephew Gene. The only circumstance in which his siblings Alberto and Maria would have been entitled to those cash advances and a share in the estate would have been if Gene died before he turned 25. So while Gene stood to inherit the estate when he turned 25, meanwhile, Alberto and Maria were to only receive weekly stipends. So long, ugly story short, Ullman, as executor, was screwed, because he did not have the entire will in hand the previous 4 years, and during that time he advanced $59,027.33 to Alberto and Maria. To that point, by today's exchange rate times 13, this would be $767,355.29. And as an executor, he was financially responsible for any improper disbursements, even if they were to Valentino's siblings, the Valentino estate. Now, by that insane twist of fate, legally, Ullman owed this enormous amount of money to the very people who spent the money and petitioned him for it. And I add that I cite those numbers of the advances to Alberto and Maria from George Ullman from his appeals case under the extracts from the Baskerville audit and the section titled The Matter of Heirship and Distribution. So the appearance of this copy of the second page of Valentino's will, which the court would accept and declare a valid portion of Valentino's will and label paragraph 4th, presented Mr. Ullman with some very bad news. But despite this, the most shocking bit of information for him to see on that carbon copy was the witness who signed the document on September 1st, 1925, none other than Handyman Luther H. Mahoney. I am sure it took Ullman one flat second to realize that not only did Lou know of the existence of this missing portion of the will throughout those long 4 years, when Ullman was disbursing money in good faith to the wrong heirs, Lou said absolutely nothing about it. Now, when the hearing resumed in January 1931, Ullman and Raymond Stewart entered the courtroom armed and ready and presented the carbon copy to the judge. Lou Mahoney and Alberto were in the courtroom that day as they were due to testify, and when they realized the carbon copy had been found, they both began panicking. I say panicking because based on their subsequent testimony that day, they were left scrambling for explanations. They could not coordinate their stories before their testimony, which was covered in the press, and it went like this. Lou testified first, and I read about this as an excerpt from Affairs Valentino, page 209. And I quote, Lou Mahoney was again subpoenaed to testify and trudged back to the witness stand. Under oath, he acknowledged he signed the sheet of instructions as a witness, but blamed the disappearance of the original copy of that portion of the will upon Mr. Valentino himself. In response to a question as to how Mr. Valentino could tamper with his will in the days following his own death, Lou had an answer. He alleged that on the day before Mr. Valentino left Hollywood for the last time in July of 1926, he summoned him to Falcon Lair's office and opened the safe. It was then, Lou said, that Mr. Valentino removed his will and showed him both pages of the document. Under further questioning, Lou could offer no explanation why his boss shared his will with his handyman at that particular time. Lou went on to recall that it was early the following morning when Mr. Valentino drove to Pola Negri's home to say goodbye before leaving on his trip east. According to Lou, a short while later, Mr. Valentino telephoned him, requesting he drive to Pola Negri's as he needed a ride home. Again, Lou could offer no explanation why Mr. Valentino drove his own vehicle to Pola Negri's and then telephoned his handyman for a ride home. Sidestepping certain deep holes in his testimony, Lou continued. In his gravelly voice, he testified that Mr. Valentino returned home that day with ample time to open his office safe and destroy that second page of his will before leaving for New York on the evening train. Lou was also adamant he drove his boss to meet that train. Lou was then asked if he personally witnessed Mr. Valentino removing the sheet of instructions from the will, or if he had any knowledge why Mr. Valentino would destroy a critical portion of his will before leaving on a routine promotional tour. Lou replied no to both questions. With another sidestep, Lou testified that he returned to Falcon Lair's office the day after Mr. Valentino left Los Angeles and attempted to open the safe. He told the court he was unable to do so because the lock had been changed. Lou had no recollection of why he needed to open his boss's safe on that particular day, and instead turned an accusatory finger on a more ready target, Alberto Valentino. Lou alleged it was Mr. Alberto Guglielmi Valentino who was the guilty party and that he changed the safe's combination the very morning Mr. Rudolph Valentino left Los Angeles. Lou had honed his nerve as a cop with one of the toughest precincts in New York City, and despite further intense interrogation, he did not flinch. In his final version of events, Lou swore his boss Rudolph Valentino shared the contents of his 2-page will with him shortly before leaving on a trip from which he never returned. And according to Lou, Mr. Valentino then proceeded to secretly destroy the second page of his will before his departure from Los Angeles, and the following day Alberto changed the combination of the office safe. End quote. So Alberto, when he was called to the stand, took a different approach to the shock evidence presented, and in his panic, he told a contrary story, claiming the original document, then called Paragraph 4th, never existed, and the carbon copy was a forgery. He even demanded to have the judge subpoena the secretary who typed the document and her typewriter. The judge rejected this as a waste of the court's time and validated the document as part of Valentino's will. Now, Renato, I find it interesting that Alberto's strategy then seems almost genetic for the Valentino family. Whenever unwelcome documents are discovered, they seem to just say they're forgeries, as they certainly did with me with almost every document I recovered. And on Alberto's testimony, I cite page 210, 211 in Affairs Valentino. And I quote, "Across the courtroom, Alberto suffered through Lou's convoluted testimony, and when he took the witness stand, he fired back with a contrary story. He testified his brother Rudolph did not visit Pola Negri's home early on the morning of his final day in Hollywood, but instead spent the entire day at home in Falcon Lair. He continued by saying it was late afternoon when he and Rudy drove together to Pola's Ambassador Hotel bungalow, where she joined them on the drive to the Southern Pacific train station. There, he told the court, they met George and B. Ullman and said their goodbyes, and Rudy and George boarded the Southern Pacific's Lark. Alberto then explained how he drove Pola Negri home in Rudy's car before returning to Falcon Lair. He denied ever opening his brother's safe or ever changing the lock on the safe. He said that at that time he was busy preparing for his and his family's departure for New York, and insisted no one opened the office safe the day Rudy left, the day before, or the day after. With Lou and Alberto swearing to opposite stories, it was anybody's guess who had just committed perjury."
Maybe both of them.
Indeed. And this is when it was revealed in court that 3 people had the combination to the Falcon Lair office safe. Valentino, Alberto, and Lou. Now, with Valentino dead and Alberto on the funeral train, it was not such a complicated deduction to know who removed and destroyed that part of Valentino's will before Ullman got his hands on it. So why? Why did these two men tell such conflicting stories of Valentino's last day in Los Angeles and under oath? As you said, this means that one of them or both of them was straight up committing perjury. I presented my theory as to why this happened in Affairs Valentino, but in light of future discoveries I made over the ensuing years, I have new theories about the connection between Lou and Alberto and some new insight into what happened in that courtroom that day, which I will present in a moment here. So first, before I move on, I will add an aside anecdote here, which I feel reveals some of Ullman's reaction upon learning Lou knew about that missing portion of the will all along, and that he had in fact witnessed it and said nothing. So on this I share a little tale, which was told by Lou's son Howard. He writes about this on his website, and I excerpt his account. And I quote, "One evening my mother, Dad, and I were sitting in the living room listening to the Kate Smith hour when someone rang the doorbell. My dad got up and opened the door, and I heard him say, 'What the hell do you want?' Then he stepped out on the porch and closed the door. My mom got up and looked out the window and put her hand over her mouth and sucked in air, then went back and sat down. I was sitting next to the window and could hear every word said. Quote, 'We're doing a movie about Rudy and need his diary and scrapbook. What right do you have to do a movie about Rudy? Now, Lou, don't get all excited. We're calling it Valentino as I knew him.'" End quote. Now, I also believe Ullman appeared on Lou's porch and in a state of total fury. But this version of that, I believe, was later concocted by Lou because it makes no sense for several reasons. If this did happen, as it was related by Lou's son, it would have been a ludicrous occurrence. First of all, because Ullman had nothing to do with the Ed Small movie, and on this I cite the S. George Ullman memoir, page 96. And I quote, "Other producers, sensing a possible quick buck, also issued announcements that they were preparing screenplays based upon the life of Valentino. Mr. Small announced that he would base his production on my book Valentino as I Knew Him, and engaged several prominent writers to prepare screenplays. I talked with Mr. Small on a few occasions and tried to make him understand that there had to be more to a picture than the bare outline in my volume, because there was a spiritual aspect about Rudy that should be an important ingredient. But even though several very excellent screenplays were presented to him, he and George Bruce, a writer friend of Small's, left Hollywood for Palm Springs to write their version of the Valentino screenplay. I read this before production began and vehemently told Small that it was very bad. But he went ahead anyway, and the resulting picture was amateurish. The star, Tony Dexter, tried to emulate Valentino, but the result was rather pitiful. The picture lost a lot of money for Columbia Pictures Corporation, who had financed and released it, and caused the almost total oblivion of Tony Dexter, who really was a competent actor." End quote. And secondly, Lou's son's version of the events that took place on Lou's porch seem implausible, because the Kate Smith show was only on television for 6 months in the beginning of 1960, and Ed Small's movie was made in 1951, 9 years earlier. And by 1960, Ullman was retired. Now, I allege Ullman did appear for a furious confrontation on Lou's porch, but after Ullman discovered Lou knew about the second page of the will all along, and said nothing while he was dispersing enormous amounts of money to the people he thought were the rightful heirs. But this would have taken place the end of 1930, or in January of 1931.
But Lou was supportive of Ullman in his fall 1930 testimony.
While Lou was testifying on Ullman's behalf on the witness stand, in November 1930, He did not then dispute certain other key elements of his involvement in the Valentino estate settlement, which came to light for me in those court records. For the record, I address a few of those. 1. The subject of the dry cleaning business. According to the court records, in various references, Rudolph Valentino owned a dry cleaning business at the time of his death. In the settlement of the estate, Ullman's dispensation of that business, of course, came under the court's scrutiny. Ullman sold the Ritz dry cleaning business to Lou Mahoney for $250. This after Ullman cleared the cleaner's outstanding debt, and by 1930, Lou had paid $100 of that $250, according to the Baskerville audit of George Ullman's executor books. And in 1930, according to the Department of Commerce Bureau of the Census, 15th Census of the United States 1930 population schedule, we find Luther H. Mahoney listed, and his occupation he cites as dry cleaner. Now, despite this, in his taped interviews, which was also heavily sourced in the Jack Scagnetti book, Lou says the following, and I quote page 135 of the Scagnetti book, and I quote, "Later when I went to court to testify about the Ritz cleaning operation, the newspapers reported I was running that business. I never had anything to do with the cleaning operation," end quote. Now, did Lou deny this later in life to try to hide what took place in 1930 and 1931 in the courtroom? The court records also reveal that Ullman kept Lou on the Rudolph Valentino production company payroll, putting him in charge of the prop house on Santa Monica Boulevard. So, according to Lou's son, Lou also left his employment with Valentino in possession of, I guess, what they referred to as mementos. His daughter, in the Jack Scagnetti book, refers to these items, which once belonged to Rudolph Valentino, in her introduction to the book as, and I quote, "photographs, a letter, a record, and some books." But Lou's son speaks of other, more substantial items he claims Valentino gave to his father, and I quote, "We had a big steamer trunk in the garage that was full of his equipment. 16-ounce sparring gloves, 6-ounce boxing gloves, a body bag, a hanging punching bag, a medicine ball I could barely lift, all kinds of shorts, shirts, shoes, headgear, so he didn't hurt his sparring partner, and hundreds of still photographs. We also had props from his movie, and the one I really remember was a jeweled-handled sword. If you will look on page 14 of the Scagnetti book, you will notice Rudy's left hand resting on a sword handle. That's the sword I used to play with." And I excerpt a little bit farther into his narrative, and I quote, "All the Valentino artifacts, with the exception of the 8mm Mauser rifle with an Ogie Berlin telescopic sight that was sport ties for Rudy and had his initials on the stock in black ebony, that went to my brother Jerry after my dad died, and I know for a fact he's not interested in selling it. And the .22 caliber Remington pump rifle with the same initials on the stock, only smaller, came to me. The collection was willed to my sister Madeline, and on her death to her daughter Donna and her son Robert. The last contact I had with Donna was just after she sold the entire collection to a collector, and she was supposed to get me his name, but she never did," end quote.
I tell you, Evelyn, that no Italian would give away a gun and other guns like those.
I personally doubt Valentino handed such things off to a member of his household staff, and I do not think it belonged to Valentino, the sword, but to United Artists as a prop, and probably an expensive one. Lou also mentions how he took home lace lingerie he found in Valentino's bedroom, which belonged to Pola Negri, and which Lou's wife sewed into fancy dresses for their daughter. Again, it seems implausible to me that Valentino gave any member of his staff, whether handyman, cook, maid, or groomsman, those kinds of things. But the point here is that in Lou's 1965 interview and in his taped memoir, he never mentioned those mementos, but remained focused intently on trashing Ullman every 3 minutes and grinding that axe. And Lou made some claims in those tapes, which I discovered were false. I cite a more notable one I feel needs to be addressed for the record. He claims he secured a loan of $100,000 with the Cinema Finance Company for Valentino in 1926. He alleges his brother organized the loan with 3 businessmen who put the money up for the loan by forming the Cinema Finance Company, and this took place just shortly before Valentino's death in 1926. And I'm going to quote my transcript of one of his tapes where he says, and I quote, "It was arranged, and they formed what was then known as the Cinema Finance Company. Those 3 men deposited the money into the Cinema Finance, and the Cinema Finance loaned $100,000 with the help of my brother to go to Mr. Ullman," end quote. Now, I can say that no, the handyman did not organize this loan. It was not made up of 3 men who put the money up for the loan in 1926. The Cinema Finance Corporation was organized and founded in July of 1921. And I cite an article in the Los Angeles Times from July 22nd, 1921, titled, "Film Financing Body Organized. 2 Million Corporation to Back Pictures. Leading local businessmen are on the directorial board." And I quote, "Announcement was made yesterday that local bankers and businessmen have virtually completed the organization of a motion picture financing corporation to extend financial aid to Los Angeles' largest industry. And as a result, papers are being filed with the Secretary of State in Sacramento incorporating the new organization under the name of the Cinema Finance Corporation." And further down we read, among the Los Angeles businessmen who will serve as directors of the Cinema Finance Corporation are the following: John B. Miller, president of the Southern California Edison Company; Thomas H. Ince, motion picture producer; Harry Chandler, president and general manager of the Times-Mirror, etc., etc. And we also find other references to this lending organization in an article dated June 11th, 1925, titled "Screen Finance Merger is Told." The Cinema Finance Corporation, established several years ago by Los Angeles Capital to finance independent film producers, etc., etc. So, no, the Cinema Finance Corporation loan to Rudolph Valentino was not organized by the handyman and 3 other people in 1926.
Lou not telling anyone about the second page of the will for those 4 years had a terrible impact on Ullman, didn't it?
It did. It completely ruined him. The lower court held him responsible for the money he dispersed, all of it, and he filed an appeal. On appeal in 1934, the decision was reversed and Ullman was exonerated on all charges of mismanagement. However, the court deferred the issue of the monies he dispersed by saying, and I quote the appeal's decision, "If the advances were made in good faith and at the solicitation of the beneficiaries, and defendant is held to be accountable to the estate, therefore, he should be given an appropriate fairness lien against the beneficial interest of those who participated in the advancement of the property and funds of the estate," end quote. So this was the appeals court telling the estate, Alberto and Jean at that point, to back off. Do not hold Ullman responsible to pay them for the money they spent, and settle this issue up when Jean Valentino turned 25 and inherited the estate. Now, when that day arrived, Jean and Alberto decided not to establish that fairness lien, and instead they pursued Ullman for 30 years, his entire professional life. Pursued him with wage garnishment orders while collecting and trying to collect the money they already spent. And while telling anyone who could listen for the rest of both of their lives the lie that they never got a dime, just, quote, a few sentimental objects When in court, Alberto testified to having received checks at least twice for $10,000 apiece, plus his weekly stipend. And I cite a bit of Alberto's testimony from the reporter's transcript, the hearing on partial distribution, page 194. And I quote, he is asked by the court, did Mr. Ullman advance any money on behalf of did he advance any money to you or pay any money to you relating to the Valentino estate prior to the beginning of the 100 a week? Alberto answers, yes, he did, $10,000. Again questioned, when was the $10,000 paid? Alberto answers, I got $10,000 in June 1927 and in December 1926. Also, so far as I can remember, I am not absolutely sure about the dates. The court replies, I see. All right. Alberto says, I am sure about the amount. End quote. And in a letter to Valentino French biographer Jean de Recville, Alberto claims he and his sister received only, and I quote, a few sentimental items from his brother's estate. As I mentioned earlier, just from the court extracts I have up until 1930, the total Alberto and Maria received from Ullman was some $60,000. As I referenced previously, that would be over $250,000 by today's exchange rate. A long way off from a few sentimental objects, and some of those objects were expensive items, very much so. And after 1930, there were profitable lawsuits and royalties for the family. But now let's look at my new theories on this story and ponder. If Lou had done the right thing and told the court and Ullman promptly about that second page of the will, paragraph 4th, and shared this information as soon as Ullman returned from New York in September of 1926, if Lou revealed that he signed that second page of the will as a witness, that it existed, and told him of the contents, life would have been very, very different for Alberto Valentino. If the probate court knew initially, back in 1926, that the minor child Jean was Valentino's sole rightful heir, the first thing that would have happened would have been that the court would have appointed a legal guardian to protect his interests. Ullman would have then proceeded with authority to run Rudolph Valentino Productions until Jean was 25, turning all profits from the business and the estate over to him. But if Lou verified the existence and content of that missing piece of the will by telling the court about it in the immediate time frame after Valentino's death, Alberto would have received only a weekly stipend of $100, his sister Maria even less. Which brings me to my revised theory as to why Lou Mahoney destroyed that second page of the will and said nothing. Over the years since I first published Affairs Valentino, I began to wonder, how was Lou able to get so grand in the late 1960s and spin those mighty yarns without the Valentino family saying a word? How was Lou able to walk away from Falcon Lair with all of that fabulous and valuable loot that he did? Why was he lionized over time? And why do the collectors in the Valentino family, even today, not accuse him for having such items as they still do about Ullman? Why? In my opinion, after analyzing this case for 2 decades of my life, and when all the pieces of evidence are on the table, so to speak, the circumstantial case presents this hypothesis for me, that Lou Mahoney was the Valentino family's sacred cow, absolutely untouchable, because way back when, he did a huge favor for Alberto. A couple of big-ass favors, I think, which would forever benefit Alberto Valentino and his family. Now, one favor I will refer to as the jewelry connection. And on this, I quote one of the stories Lou related to his son, who writes this on his website, and I quote, Rudy had a mirror-lined dressing room in Falcon Lair, The dressing table was all mirrors. In the table was a drawer that had a secret button to push, and pull the drawer out again. In the back compartment were the family heirlooms, jewelry, and other items he was protecting. 3 people knew of this false drawer: Rudy, my dad, and Ullman. Rudy was dead. My dad never had that kind of money, but items would have brought on the open market. Those items would have brought money on the open market. And Ullman came up with a windfall about 6 months after Rudy died." End quote. Now, based on what I know, I do not buy that story at all. I knew from 2 sources that Alberto ended up in possession of what was described as a box of some 50 pieces of Rudy's jewelry, and this in the immediate days after his brother's death. Valentino memorabilia collector Bill Self told me about this when he also told me Alberto had the box of jewelry and most of his brother's clothes. He reiterated this when he told me with great pride about his acquiring Valentino's platinum watch, which Alberto had. Now, and I add, by the way, Renato, Michael Morris was allowed to peep into Self's closet, where he kept all of Valentino's clothes, which he said were still on the old hangers. So Bill Self told me Alberto had the jewelry, and Ullman wrote about this too in his memoir. Now, why would Lou in 1968 even choose to tell this story? Again, he seemed to manage to gain access to these safes. I guess it could be argued as a handyman he needed to have access, but I find it odd he would even know about it. So, does Lou really expect anyone to believe George Ullman sold the jewelry and then Alberto bought it back from the very person Ullman sold it to? No, again, I do not think this happened. Alberto could not have afforded to buy it all back, and he had no need to. I think in mentioning such specific points in his memories, Lou was possibly justifying a situation for posterity and shifting all blame onto his nemesis, George Ullman. Now, Lou's big favor for Alberto number 2, that missing page of the will. And again, I present my hypotheses. This came to us a year or so ago when you, Renato, were translating the book The True Rudolph Valentino by Balthasar Coué. This is the book Valentino was working on when he died, and as a Spanish journalist, Balthasar Coué published it in Spanish in the movie magazine Cine Mundial in 1927. So in his book, we read on page 120, and I quote, "It has been said that moments before Rudolph died, he whispered some secret words as a message in the ear of his great comrade Frank Manillo. Manillo would then in turn only whisper them in the ear of Alberto Guglielmi Valentino." End quote. So, what would Valentino have whispered to his godfather Frank Manillo, and knowing he was about to die? Not to be crass here, but honestly, I do not think it would be his recipe for spaghetti sauce or "don't forget to feed my dogs." It was something as heavy as that moment, something important, deeply emotional and meaningful, and something Manillo told Alberto the moment he arrived back in New York City, and told only Alberto. I think it was probable that Rudy told Manillo he left everything to young Gene on that second page of the will, which was in his office safe. I think he would have wanted, above all, to ensure his beloved sole heir received his estate. And I think Alberto placed a phone call to Falcon Lair immediately. He knew Lou had access to that office safe, and that it was imperative that second page be removed before Ullman returned to file the will with the court. And Alberto also knew he would arrive back in Los Angeles with Ullman, leaving him no time to take care of that business. Everything went off perfectly, without a hitch, and it would have remained that way for posterity. But it came to pass that in January 1931, in that L.A. courtroom, when Ullman and Raymond Stewart presented that ragged copy of paragraph 4th to the judge, the ruse was up, and both Lou and Alberto seemed to be tripping over themselves to come up with a plausible excuse for that paper's disappearance. With Lou concocting a tale how Valentino called him into his office before leaving for New York City, opened the safe, showed him the paper, and destroyed it, never offering a reason why any of that would occur. And Alberto thinking it wiser by the time he was sworn in on the witness stand to just say that carbon copy is a forgery, never existed.
And the Valentino collectibles Lou was permitted to keep. I read about those in an interview with Tracy Ryan Toyun recently.
Yes. While Tracy Ryan Toyun and the other collectors nitpick about the things Ullman sold over the years or gifted to collector Bill Self, and they seize every possible opportunity to smear his name with black market insinuations, they do not mention how Lou came to have all he did. Valentino gave it to him, and they do not cast the meekest disparagement towards the Mahoneys or Lou for how the collectibles were obtained or dispersed. Now, did Valentino know he was about to die when he left Los Angeles for New York City and gave all of this to a $45 a week member of his staff? As you said, that's the worst fairy tale ever. So who ended up with all of Lou's treasures? For this, I am quoting a Q&A with Tracy Terhune on From His Fame Still Lives, dated October 11th, 2019, and I quote, "The question is, you have a vast collection of Rudy-related items, which has grown over time. I'd like to ask you, which was the very first thing you acquired and when?" And he answers, "The very first items I obtained were the Luther Mahoney items. They are pictured in the 1975 book about Valentino by Jack Scagnetti. I had recently read the book and saw those items pictured, and remembered thinking, I wonder who owns those now. 2 weeks later, I attended a local memorabilia show, and there they were, all in plastic bags and marked, personal property of Rudolph Valentino. It turns out, after Luther Mahoney's death, his daughter Madeline Mahoney Reed Mahoney, inherited them, but she had recently died and they were sold off to a dealer who in turn was selling them off piece by piece. I thought it was sad that these were all kept together, and now this was happening. I bought several of the items, and that's how I got started," end quote. So, there you have it.
I know you have a personal insight into this story you want to mention.
I do, Renato. As you know, my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a handyman on a large estate in upstate New York, working for Frederick Roosevelt, a wealthy first cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. My grandfather always referred to him as Mr. Roosevelt, and I cannot imagine him entertaining he was ever a personal confidant or ever in a position to consider himself a business associate. Lou's referring to Valentino as Mr. Valentino brought that home to me because I recalled my own handyman grandfather calling his employer the same. This gave it away for me. Throughout all of his interviews and the tapes, he referred to Natasha and Rudolph as Mr. and Mrs. Valentino. For the most of the time, he referred to George Ullman as Mr. Ullman. This, to me, was indicative of his actual position in that household. So in discovering what I did about what happened to Ullman, in my opinion, it is obvious why Lou Mahoney took off on Ullman in 1968 and got that unjust hate Ullman ball rolling. But certainly, in light of what happened to Ullman as a result of Lou not acknowledging the existence of that second page of the will, Lou did not need to trash the man as he did. It was false and unfounded, and for me it only emphasized what a tough job Ullman had managing Valentino's business, which he did extremely well career-wise. Look at those last 2 movies Valentino made, The Eagle and the Son of the Sheik. They were exceptional. Rudolph Valentino and George Ullman were a fabulous team. And I add that in Ullman's 1975 memoir, he is restrained in recalling the collection processes brought against him by Alberto Valentino, as Alberto sought to collect money he spent decades before. And Ullman did not mention Handyman Lou a single time. However, in Lou's tape memoir, He portrays Ullman as a complete boogeyman. And I feel it bears a mention that in Lou's 1965 interview, he made a point of saying how Valentino was still in a, quote, borrowed crypt. And I cite an article from the LA Times on August 22nd, 1965, titled, "Marker on the Borrowed Crypt Where Valentino Rests," in which Lou refers to, quote, the unfortunate way they treat his body. Now, Alberto paid for that crypt in full, and Valentino's body was never abused in the process of being interred. I cite this to a letter Alberto wrote to the French Valentino biographer Jean de Recville, in which he emphatically states he bought the crypt. So as the crypt is not borrowed, I find it odd Lou is trying to rally support to find Valentino a suitable burial place in 1968. I think in being mentioned like this, we see how adamant Lou was to be remembered as the hero of Valentino's story, as he elevates himself to a lofty position while diminishing others in the process. But in his telling his tales of being Valentino's personal confidant, despite no one mentioning him for over 40 years of biographies, Lou lamentably found it necessary to again destroy the very man his actions did in fact destroy in 1931, George Ullman. Did Lou do Alberto the greatest favor of all by issuing this screed against Ullman in 1968? And for this, did and has the family and their minions never made and still do not make any slight move to seize or lay claim to that memorabilia? Is this why he is so worshipped? Because Lou is held so high in their esteem as some grandfatherly and vital personage in Valentino's life. Well, Lou was Valentino's age, 1 year older, and he was in no position to be granting sage fatherly wisdom and advice to his famous employer. It is also worth mentioning here how many titles Lou gave himself in his employment with Valentino in his Renaissance in the 60s. The list is long. Now, in Lou's obituary, in the Newport Beach Daily Pilot, April 29, 1968, he is referred to as his personal affairs manager. And Lou refers to himself as the superintendent of the Valentino estate, Valentino's personal valet, general factotum in the Valentino household. This was a title Ullman was actually called in the court records, by the way. And Lou referred to himself again as Valentino's chauffeur, his caretaker, his affairs manager, his personal manager, and custodian of mementos. And Lou's son also refers to his father as a, quote, producer and cameraman on The Son of the Sheik. Now, we searched the cast and crew for the film and did not find that to be so. I believe Lou was, in fact, a handyman who happened to be in the right place at the right time to change some history for Valentino's brother Alberto. I think he saw an opportunity and thought he might have been helping. But the favor he did for Alberto robbed Jean of his rightful inheritance, obviously. And it might very well have caught Lou between a rock and a hard place the moment that copy of paragraph 4th showed up in the courtroom. Now, in closing here, I'm just going to rebut a few other themes Lou repeats as fact in those tapes, which I dispute. Lou repeats again and again that Ullman wanted to gain control over Valentino. I think we learned in our episode on Robert Flory and the Magic Lantern how very much in control of his own business Rudolph Valentino was. I find it demeaning to Valentino to portray him as some hapless victim. This was not the case at all, as I discovered. And I challenge those long conversations, which Lou can incredibly recall verbatim after some 40 years. These are not quotes or a few lines he remembered, and it is absurd to think he can recall pages of dialogue as mile-long speeches Valentino allegedly told him. Lou also never presents any clarification about the money George Ullman owed Alberto. And I dispute that there was bad blood between Ullman and Natasha Rambova, as he helped her out after she left Los Angeles And in her memoir, in those revelations, which we included in our book, Astral Affairs Rambova, in those revelations, which were allegedly transcriptions from Valentino speaking to her from beyond the grave, Ullman appears and Natasha writes, greeting him, saying, "Oh, it's dear George." Now, I assert emphatically George Ullman had no influence over the Valentino's love life. That's an insult to both Natasha Rambova and Rudolph Valentino. And I'm going to close here with an excerpt, a few thoughts from Affairs Valentino, page 289. And I quote, "Although many of Lou's recollections were foggy inaccuracies, he exhibited superhuman powers of memory while relating certain conversations verbatim which he claimed took place 40 years earlier. These selected conversations cast him in the role of power broker, peacemaker, and fatherly confidant to his employers, Mr. and Mrs. Valentino. He made no mention of the settlement of the estate or of his role in the court proceedings. He also blamed Mr. Ullman for everything, from the Valentino's divorce to Natasha's exclusion from Rudy's United Artists contract and for outright embezzling every cent of Rudy's fortune. He also erroneously took full credit for negotiating a loan for Rudy from the Cinema Finance Company and timed this loan a full year before its actual transaction. Lou's fractured fairy tale of life in the Valentino household, where he, as the venerable handyman, appeared to hold the seat of power at the head of the dinner table, became more of the questionable, undocumented fabrication that was soon believed to be fact. For even though Raymond Lee chose to omit Lou Mahoney's screed about George Ullman in his article, Lou's taped reminiscences were soon in circulation, and future publications on Valentino were taking a fresh look at the handyman's role in the movie star's life. With Lou Mahoney bolstering Jean and Alberto Valentino's 30-year vilification of George Ullman, the truth about Rudy's manager faded not so slowly from the public domain. And as George continued to say nothing, the resulting new version of the story became a patchwork artifice of inaccuracies, with Lou Mahoney the hero, George Ullman a thug, and Rudolph Valentino a gay icon." End quote.
So I think in reading the Ullman memoir, you vetted Mahoney's tape memoir too. And the story he neglected to tell was an important one.
It was not a small bit of history in the Valentino story. And in light of how Mahoney is deified today by the Valentino family's minions and the collectors, I felt it important this aspect of Mahoney's story be addressed and documented, because to leave it out is to censor, to edit history, and create a false portrait of the man and his actual involvement. I know there's no smoking gun to my latest hypotheses, but I based it on what I feel is a compelling and very strong circumstantial case. And circumstantial evidence has sent people to prison for life. It is a critical aspect of any investigation, I think, to build your case with as much evidence as possible. And I feel I have presented more than enough in this case. You know, Renato, there's one other odd and I feel revelatory commentary or circumstantial piece of evidence on Handyman Lou's role in this Valentino story. And this is as close to his being mentioned in those years he disappeared as we find. And this by Natasha Rambova in the play she wrote, All That Glitters. She never published the play, and it was never produced. And we've included it in its entirety, by the way, in our book, Beyond Valentino. But the characters in the play are based on real people, and anyone knowing the story quickly can recognize Ullman, Skank, Marion Davies, and Natasha creates the character of the butler she calls Buckle, who for me is most assuredly and obviously Lou Mahoney. This is why. As the plot line resolves, it is revealed Butler Buckle was running a dry cleaning business to profit from cleaning Valentino's clothes and movie wardrobes, citing this as a form of graft within the Valentino household. Now, Natasha has Buckle save the day in her plotline by turning a profit with the business. But how revealing, I think. In closing, I want to reiterate, I was the messenger and brought these uncomfortable truths forward. I do not do this to impugn anyone's father or grandfather, nor do I present documentation to assassinate. I do so because this is what took place. If one did not know the backstory here, it would be easy to listen to the gravelly voice of this 75-year-old Lou Mahoney and think he had no reason to exaggerate or elaborate or censor anything. But seriously, I think it's all something to ponder.
For today, I want to, as always, remind to our listeners that all of our books with their stories, which are so eager to be shared, are available on Amazon and other book-selling venues.
And I want to, as always, thank our great supporters, those of you who write in to encourage us, to share commentary and analysis, and contribute images and material which we use in those podcasts. You are also very appreciated. Believe me, you are. And I hope our listeners, Renato, will also check out our blog at Evelyn Zumaya, one word, .blogspot.com.
And as the usual, I say, Fiat Justitia, Ruat Celum. And for the good guys, arrivederci.